Today we're going to take a peek at Docker and see how one would use it in an enterprise type environment. Over here in this panel on the bottom left, you'll notice 4 images. One is a Postgres SQL database. Another is Redis broker. We'll get into more of that later. Third, you probably heard of React. And fourth is a Django backend, which will be used as an API. The demonstration app that I went ahead and threw together was one that collected weather data in the city I live in and displays it in React recharts. This graph is in Kelvin, temperature. This graph is volume and amount of rain and snow on a daily basis. And thirdly is the miles per hour, as shown here. This side of things is the API. Basically, whenever React queries this URL, it'll be sent a series of JSON objects, and this is the schema. And just for proof that this is actually ran from Docker, let's go ahead and spin this down. Refresh the pages. And there we go. Let's dive into it. All right, assuming you've navigated to the directory you wish to install this project at, let's go ahead and clone it. This is a publicly available URL that I've thrown up on GitHub. You can find my username at peak prototype, and the repository's name is Docker Enterprise Project YouTube. Let's go ahead and enter. Just a quick note, for the purposes of recording a YouTube video, I've made the font much larger than I'm used to, so you might notice me doing some weird sizing thing with Windows. Quick note, normally you wouldn't see a folder that holds another folder. The reason this exists in my system is because this is a third iteration of this Docker Enterprise app that I'm going through, so I have separate folders for each iteration. Normally you would only see just the Docker Enterprise project as the parent folder. All right, now that we're past the disclaimer section, let's go ahead and get into this. First and foremost, you'll notice I have a series of links to stuff that helped me when I was going through this the initial time. Feel free to use it if you wish. I probably won't be referencing any of this in this YouTube video. Some things you will have to do before getting started with this project: you'll have to download Docker. You'll have to install a Docker Compose. You'll likely have to do some system configuration stuff. Example being, make a Hyper-V switch inside of the BIOS of your motherboard. You will notice that I do have some troubleshooting stuff down here. You'll have to install Node.js and most certainly Python. Django you'll install later using the pip. So go ahead and pause the video now and get all that stuff downloaded and get your environment set up. Next step is install a virtual environment with Python. Just a quick note, the period on the end is to install it in this directory. All right, looks like it's installed. So in order to activate the virtual environment, you'll need to run the Linux command source and then the activate files. All right, you'll notice now in parentheses, we'll have the name of the virtual environment prepended on every single terminal prompt. Now that we're inside of the virtual environment, let's go ahead and install Django. So we'll run pip install Django. All right, looks like that installed just fine. All right, let's go ahead and put the Django project file folder into this project. This is important because we're creating a modular type of software, so it's important to separate those out into their own individual folders. We'll look at the layout of that later, but for now, let's just go ahead and put this into play. So we're gonna run the Linux command, make directory. Now here comes a bit of a tricky part. I've navigated into that directory I just created. We need to use the Django library we just installed to generate a Django project. And that looks like this. Now we're going to create the application, which is going to be API within this Django project. So we'll need to create another folder. All right, great. Looks like we got the key components in place. Now let's go to the next step. This next step is optional. This is simply if you're versed in the bash scripting language and you would like to run your own scripts upon server reboot or startup. Maybe you call it from the Django server side code. Who knows? We're gonna go ahead and put a simple script into the system. This is important because later when we execute the Docker compose file, we're going to set permissions of this folder. So we'll need something there so that that doesn't fail. So currently we're sitting in the API folder. We're going to need to back up one directory. Then we can create our shell scripts folder. So again, make dir for make directory. And then personally, I use the VI editor. Most people probably use Nano. All right, quick rundown on what it is I'm doing. I'm invoking the SSH pass command. What this will do is it'll allow me to pass the password of the remote server into the prompt automatically. That way a human doesn't have to babysit this command. There are a number of ways of doing this. Alternatively, this is just a simple way that I've thrown together. The rsync command, it syncs remote files to and from. In this example, I am syncing the remote server data directory with the local folder Django project. So whatever files and folders exist in the data directory over here, it's going to clone it and copy and put it over here into this local server. Again, this step is optional. You don't have to do this in order to make this project work. This is just something that I did initially and then changed how I was going about it, which happens quite often. And lastly, the semicolon is just the end of the command. It's not required. I just like seeing it. Last piece to the Django framework we're inserting is the requirements file. This is really handy in a system like this because you can tell the pip to install the packages listed in this txt file. So from our shell scripts directory, we're going to navigate back one and we're going to create the requirements txt file. Quick note, size COPG2 is for the Postgres SQL database. Django cores headers is important for basically creating the API connection between the React application and the Django. All right, let's move on to the React side of the project. From the Django project folder, we're going to backtrack one directory. Then we're going to create the React app folder. And since I downloaded Node.js on this local machine, I can run the command npx, which will create a default React application. Whoops, I forgot to name it. All right. We're just going to name it simply React UI since all it is a user interface. All right, success. Now let's move on to the next, creating the environment files, which ultimately are optional just from a development standpoint. It's really handy if you're working in a team. So let's say you have 3 engineers, but they have different credentials for different server/remote databases. It's a nice spot to configure these unique settings. So from our React app folder, let's navigate back one directory. All right, now that we're in the parent directory of our projects, let's go ahead and create the environment folder. Navigate into said folder. And instead of creating the values immediately, let's go ahead and just run the Linux command to create the files themselves, and we can go into them later, add to it. All right, now that we've created these 4 files, let's go ahead and add the values for the environment variables within these files. And just for speed, I'm going to copy and paste from the README file that I previously cloned. Now, I don't know if all development environment applications have this feature, but I do know that the PyCharm does. You just navigate to this little icon at the top left of a README file. You can click it and it copies the contents into your clipboard. So now when I go over here, first I go to insert mode, right click, paste, and boom, I got what I need. And this is probably way too late in the YouTube video to point this out, but if you're unfamiliar with VI, in order to save a file and close, you press :WQ. You can see that at the bottom left here. Hit enter, there we go. So this will need to change right away. We'll have to mirror the name of the application that we created earlier. Looks like I called that one My Django Backend. And at this point, value name is arbitrary. Essentially, all this is a folder that exists on the local machine you're spinning up the Docker project. Inside of this folder, persistent files. And what that really means is, let's say I have a database up in Docker and I commit a bunch of data to it. In order to save it, so that if I ever have to destroy the container or image and recreate a new one, I throw it into the volume that exists both within Docker and on the local machine. When the next Docker environment gets spun up and it contains this value name, it's going to reference the file that already exists, which is the database content, and we can reload it back in. That's really beyond the scope of this YouTube tutorial, but it is nice to know. So in the meantime, I'm just going to call it data. Volume data, just to be a little bit more verbose with that name. Pay special attention to whatever you name this variable right here, Postgres host. Essentially, we're going to need to copy what we key in here into the Docker compose file. That's going to do our network name translation. This will allow us to correctly connect from Django to the Postgres SQL database. So for this series, I'm going to name this My Database. And then feel free to key in whatever values you want here. This is where all the magic occurs. This configuration file manages the entire project. You can do various awesome things in Docker that I'm not going to be illustrating in this particular video, but maybe in the future. We're done with the terminal for now. Let's go ahead and add the file via this development environment. Ensure you are in the parent directory of this project. We're going to right click, hit new, go to file. This is pretty important. If you have a reason for naming this a different name, feel free to do so, but the Docker compose command is going to look for the name we're about to key in. So just make sure it's named the same way, otherwise you might run into issues. Add it to the Git repository. All right. So again, I'm going to copy and paste from the README. Now you'll notice some variables with $, squiggly bracket, and a name. These are corresponding to the environment files we created earlier. We're passing the Django env and the Postgres credentials env file to this. Here are some of the things I want to point out to you. Depends on instructs Docker Compose to spin up the service of Django after database and Redis service has been spun up. This is important because in our software package we're putting together, database is going to need to be live before Django gets online to query it, otherwise it'll cause a crash. Remember that host name that I mentioned was important to remember what we called it? We're going to use that here. So in order for this application to work, if you followed along with me thus far, you're going to need to ensure that this host name matches what you created before. All right, now that we've got this put together, let's go ahead and run this, see what happens. Before we get into doing that, however, we need to first open up the Docker desktop application and make sure it's actively running. So as you can see on the bottom left of my screen, I do in fact have it up. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of these images that I've previously created. And now that we have no images, no containers. All right, now that we know that Docker desktop is running, we got to go back and resolve a couple things that I missed in the initial write-up of the README. First of all, I forgot to write the variable names for the Redis and Postgres container name. So let's go ahead and do that now. Then in the file, I've included that here. This corresponds to the variables used in the Docker Compose file used to name the containers. So when we look at Docker desktop, these are the names we'll see. All right, now the Docker Compose file is created, we got the variables in place. Let's go ahead and add the Docker files for each individual container that we're going to be creating using Docker Compose. Essentially, the Docker file are container level instructions on how to build the image. So we'll look at the Django one as an example. First thing it does when Docker Compose initializes the Django service is it goes through line by line. The optional one here is SSH key scan. This is the way I decided to go about connecting to the remote database that fetches the weather API information I was collecting. SSH key scan adds the destination address to the known host file. This will remove the prompt from coming up when we execute the syncing command later. The React one's pretty standard. The only difference being we're doing a yarn add recharts. That's just to show those graphs that I demonstrated at the beginning of the video. Inside the Django project, let's go ahead and add that Docker file. Now for me, I'm gonna blur this out, but I'm gonna add the actual Linode IP server that I got spun up that fetches the data for me. You don't need a remote server to make this work. I just didn't want to run my home PC 24/7 to collect data every 15 minutes. The Django Docker file is created. Let's move on to the React. So navigate to the folder we created earlier, add the Docker file to the folder. All right, we should be ready to run this command now. Forgot to change some of the variables. In this YouTube version, I went ahead and changed the directory name. So we're just gonna change this to what we keyed in earlier, React. All right, let's try again. right. Looks like we are done. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. You can see it spinning up the 4 containers. All right, good deal. Let's navigate to the Django project. I believe there's a caching issue because we haven't wrote any code to force us to go to this API should we navigate to the home directory. I'll be right back. All right, yep, just what I thought. It was some kind of caching issue. I went ahead and opened up a private browser. That way it wouldn't retain any credentials of the past. And as you can see, we have successfully connected to the Django default application. Let's go check the React one now. All right, as you can see, there's been some kind of issue with our React application. So let's go ahead and dive into that and figure out what went wrong. While I was changing the configuration of this project and playing around, Docker desktop started throwing errors messages at me. The only resolution there was to reboot my PC, just get a fresh restart on everything. That seemed to work. After getting that resolved, I was still having issues getting the React application to stay running. Kept not being able to find the package.json file, even though it was present. I'm still a little unclear as to why this was the resolution, but as you'll notice, inside of each one of these services, I've removed the volume declaration, and that seemed to work. So, yeah. You'll notice here at the bottom of the terminal that this is the output for all 4 of the applications, rather services in the Docker environment we just created. Let's double check to see if the React Native is actually working. And as you can see right here, we have the default React Native application running. And yeah, that's it for today.